Well, welcome back to Goaldigger. I'm Kate Luzio, founder and CEO of Luminary and the host of Goaldigger, which we have been hosting now almost 2 years right here live on LinkedIn every Friday. I'm really excited, and I'm going to tell a story later on how I met Daisy for the first time, if she remembers. But Daisy Auger Dominguez, the Chief People Officer at Vice Media Group, but also the author of the new book, The Inclusion Revolution, which we're going to get into why she wrote it, what it's all about, what you can do, but more importantly, hear a little bit about her story and how she got to where she is. So welcome, Daisy. It's so good to have you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
So we met I think 3 years ago. Do you remember where we met?
I can't remember now.
We were at the pre-show for the constitutional play.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And we're sitting there and we're sort of like on our own, and we're like, I think I know you. I've seen you around.
It was at the reception.
Exactly. And ever since then, as soon as I'm like, I gotta follow this woman. And so it's been, that's literally like 3 years ago, because maybe a little 2.5. And whoa, the world has changed. Wow, your life has changed, because when we met, you were still running your consulting business. You had not yet taken the role at Vice, and obviously now you're a freaking author. So let's walk back to your story and tell the audience a little bit more about you and sort of what led you to this path and where you're at today.
Oh, goodness. Well, I always start with the beginning. And, I was born in New York City to teenage parents. My father's Dominican, my mother's Puerto Rican. And they were ill-equipped to raise me. So I did what I call the opposite migratory pattern. I went from New York to the Dominican Republic, and I was raised by my paternal grandparents. So I grew up as essentially the last child of my grandparents. But I also grew up going to an international school in the Dominican Republic, because the intent was always, ever since I can remember, that I was going to get the best education possible so that I could come back to the United States to study. And my family was working class, barely middle class, but they were able to cobble up enough money to send me to this wonderful school. And I grew up, Kate, with kids from all over the world. My best friends growing up were Danish, Israeli, Chinese, Japanese, Caribbean. We were enveloped in difference ever since I can remember. And we were navigating identity and heritage and nationality at a very young age. But I was also navigating it in a world, in an island where I was the majority, right? And so it was having one foot in and one foot out from an identity perspective, from a class perspective. And then when I was 16, my father moved me to New Jersey, New Milford, New Jersey, for anyone that's out there, with the intent of coming to finish my junior year of high school here, because someone had told him, my dad's a doorman at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, and he befriends everybody. And he was telling someone about his daughter that he was so proud of, that was going to go to university in the United States. And someone said, it was like, well, she should probably be taking her PSATs, getting ready for college. And my father literally bought a house he could ill afford. My grandparents came with me to help with the transition and ended up staying. And all of a sudden, when I was 16, I became Hispanic within the US context. I had been Dominican and Puerto Rican. I had been so many things for so long. And all of a sudden I come to the US, and I now have to navigate this new identity. And so again, the concept of identity and difference comes into the fold, but now I'm not part of the majority. I am now part of the them, right? The others.
The others, right.
And that was really when I started contextualizing it, and there's nothing like you experiencing it yourself to start realizing, wait a second, I'm not part of this monolithic group that everyone seems to place me in, this box that I have to literally check every time I introduce myself to someone. That and not only that I have to check, but that I also have to question and deconstruct for people, so that when they look at me, they're thinking, well, you should be this, right? My high school counselor would often say, surprised, how I spoke English so well. I made things so much easier for them. And, and I remember that often. And she was actually such a kind lady, but I remember that because that also set the tone for my career, Kate. And the experience that we as women have, and women of color, is that we make ourselves so small, and because we want to make things easier for everybody else, because things are so hard for us.
Right.
And so, so to make things a little easier for us, well, let me make things easier for you. So I'll be the good student. I'll be the good kid. I'll be the kid that speaks English, so you don't have to worry about getting a translator for me. I was the student in the English AP classes that my English teacher would chastise the rest of the classmates by saying, "Oh my goodness, the foreigner speaks better English than all of you." And these subtle messages, Kate, they tell us where we are placed in the context of our society and our communities. And so from high school, I went on to my undergrad. I went to Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a small, tiny school. And I like to say that while I became Hispanic when I moved to the US, I became a person of color when I went to Bucknell, because that's where I started understanding my place within the context of race, class, and gender in the United States. And my friends at Bucknell were the Black and brown kids. They were the places where I found my safety, my comfort, but also where I started understanding concepts of identity, intersectionality. I was learning all of these pieces years and years ago before they became in vogue, because I had teachers around me that were willing to teach it. And I was so hungry and curious about it. And so my undergraduate degree is in international relations and women's studies. I was just always wanting to learn, like, what's up with this difference, and how do we make it more equal and just? And then after my undergrad, I did my graduate degree. I went straight to NYU and I got my master's in public administration. And again, there, my focus was on multiculturalism and race, class, and gender. And after that, I did a fellowship in public affairs, the Choral Fellows Program, which was an amazing experience. And then after that, I realized, oh my goodness, I have never had a real job. I am just studying. And my father, bless his heart, who adored me, was just really worried about whether I was ever going to get a job. And Kate, this speaks a little bit to the naivete that you have, and also the lack of experience and support. There were professionals in my family, but no one who had ever worked in the corporate space, no one who had ever worked in these environments. So no one was able to help me navigate that. But, through a friend of my father's, actually, I got an introduction. My resume was presented to someone at Moody's. And that's how I got my first job at Moody's Investor Service as a credit risk analyst in the public finance department.
Alice
Sistani, my dad's friend, worked at Moody's, knew someone, gave them my resume. And I always say I was hired by the grace of Nicole Johnson, because all of my peers had masters. They all had MBAs. I was one of the few MPAs with public administration, but she saw something in me that many people didn't see. I had been rejected in so many corporations up until that point. I was sending my resume to all the banks, and they were all like, you don't have any economics backgrounds. You don't have any finance background, which was true. But Nicole saw something in me. And Kate, I had a 12-year career at Moody's. I was a credit risk analyst for 6 years. From there, I transitioned to manage our global foundation for 3 years. And then from there, I was given the opportunity to launch the company's first diversity and inclusion function in HR. And that's when I made my transition to HR. So I started my career on the business side of an organization. And I frankly went into HR kind of kicking and screaming, because back then I had the same perception a lot of people have of HR. That's the place you go to when you're in trouble.
Right.
It's a dead end job. I mean, this was, nearly 2 decades ago. I mean, it's even worse, even though still the perceptions are the same. But I had a sponsor in our CFO, who was a female CFO, sorry, who was really committed to advancing women. And, and she really pushed me to take this job, and not only pushed me, but offered me support and guidance. And this was my first introduction into sponsorship. I didn't even know you called it sponsorship at that point, Kate. I knew later,
right? Like we're in the same age group, right? I mean, that term sponsorship, mentorship, you just knew someone was looking out for you.
Totally. She literally told me, hey, because I had said no to the job the first time. And she said, no one says no when I put their name in the hat. And I was like, what hat do you speak of? I was like, I have no idea that these things even existed. But that was my introduction, Kate, like many of us, to start to understand the inner workings of power in organizations, the inner workings of access and opportunity. And when I took this job, they didn't really expect me to do what I did. They thought I was, this bright, young, motivated, analyst who had done great work, a woman of color. Let's just put her in this role and, and she'll be okay. And I really came into my own, Kate. I realized this is the job I should have been doing my entire life.
Yeah.
This is where all of these pieces of intersectionality, of identity, of being yourself, and also understanding the business fundamentals of the company and understanding what was needed for us to succeed and deliver for all of our stakeholders. I was able to marry the two and build a great program intended to ensure that we were delivering inclusive and equitable practices.
Daisy, what year would that have been when you took on that role in HR?
2008.
Okay, so if we
2007, I'm sorry, 2007. Yes.
Which is, so there's two kind of points I want to, so number one, the fact that they were like, let's put her in HR, because historically, and we're still seeing it now a little bit because of what the world has changed. I don't want people from the business in HR. I want lifelong HR practitioners. But how smart Moody's was, because now you know the business.
Yep.
The business knows you. People trust you. You've been on the inside. And now you're actually going to bring what their views, what's not working for them, what's working for them into HR. I mean, that is trailblazing from an organization that, I haven't seen many organizations be able to do, with the exception of the last few years.
You're absolutely right. And I have to say, it was partly visionary on their part. It was also partly just very pragmatic on their part of, let's get someone from the inside. But you're absolutely right that was critical for me to make that transition. If I had come from the outside, it would have taken me a lot longer to understand the logic of the organization, to understand how to communicate to people, to know where to go, because I knew where power resided in the organization. I knew who were the leaders that believed in this and didn't believe in this. And that's how I launched, and I did what everybody does. It's the predictable formula for diversity and inclusion. I followed it. I was figuring it out myself, but we launched employee resource groups. We put metrics in place. We were, a company of analysts, so data had to be very critical. I started also, this was also the first time in my career where I took on a dual role. So I was both the head of diversity and inclusion and of talent acquisition. And I did that intentionally when there was an opportunity to do so, because I started seeing the fact that it was like pulling teeth from recruiters to go to the diversity career fairs to, deliver the inclusive hiring processes that we were looking at. And I figured, well, if they report to me, they're going to have to do it because we're going to build this comprehensively. So that was also my first time doing talent acquisition. And then from Moody's, after a 12-year career, I left when there was really clearly no more opportunity for me to grow in the company.
Right.
At that point, I was coaching all of our executives on their next career moves. And I had to put the mirror in front of myself and say, well, what's next for me? And what was being offered to me were really lovely roles in investor relations and other parts of the business. And I was like, I didn't want those roles. I knew what I wanted, but I wanted to keep on advancing. And I had a mentor at Time Warner, Lisa Quiroz, who, again, also put my name in the hat for a job at Time Warner. And I went into their executive search function, and they were looking for someone to source for diverse executive talent. And so it was a lateral move. And I say this intentionally because when people think about making career moves, you keep on thinking it's got to be this way.
Totally.
It was a lateral move, but it was a vastly different industry. I'd never worked in media and entertainment. And it was where I say I got my PhD in media and entertainment, because I was working on the corporate side, but in any given day, I had to work with HBO, Warner Brothers, Turner, Time Inc. And so I had to quickly understand, again, the logic of all of these different places that did not want corporate to tell them what to do, wanted to run their own shows. And here are
cultures,
uniquely different cultures that had to be respected and valued, and also aligned somehow so that we could deliver on this work. And so I had to quickly learn, and these are still some of my best colleagues and friends that I've had for years, but I had to quickly learn the business. And about 2 years into that role, realized I miss being in the business side. I don't like being in corporate. I like the solving. I like the doing. And I was essentially sourcing talent and thinking up strategies, but I wasn't executing. And that's when I had the opportunity to go to Disney. And so I had again a good friend of mine, um, Erica Irish Brown, who's the head of diversity for City now. She's been all over. Erica gave my name to a recruiter who neither one of us knew was looking for this job. But literally the same day she sent my resume, his team called and said, "We have a job at Disney." And I remember calling her and going, "You've got juice." Like they just called me, like, "What is this?" And she's like, "I don't know what job it is." When I went to interview, Kate, they had been looking for this candidate for about 9 months. And the recruiter who was leading the search, Ron, he looked at me and he said, "Where have you been?" And I looked back at him and said, "You obviously have not been looking deep enough because I've been around and I've been doing this work." About a month later, my family moved to LA. My daughter at that time was about 4 years old. My husband, who is an artist and a scientist and a tinker, just has always made these moves with me, and is just my fiercest advocate. And we picked up our family and we moved to LA, to Pasadena, California. And I became the head of diversity for Disney ABC Television Group. That included at that time what is Freeform now, the Disney Family channel, the Disney Channel, ABC, the owned television stations, and ABC News. And 6 months into that job, again, our head of recruitment left. And my boss looked at me and said, "Well, how about you running both functions?" And so again, I took on this dual role. And I share this because that's how my talent and broader HR experience was being set. When I was diversity, which is what happens in all organizations, you just lead diversity, you're isolated. You are lucky if you get invited to the table to have these conversations. But because I was running diversity and talent acquisition, leaders needed to talk to me because everyone has to recruit. Right. Everyone has to hire someone. And so that became my entry point to business conversations and decisions that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to. And I did that job for 3 years and I loved it. I mean, the magic and pixie dust was real. My daughter went from age 4 to 7. So total princess stage. There was pixie dust all over my house all the time. And then one day Google called. And for a while I kind of would tell the recruiter, "Oh, that's fine, I'm happy here." And one day we just we had the conversation, and we spent a couple of weeks talking, and she just said one day, "Daisy, just come on campus and come for an interview. What's the worst thing that can happen? You get to check out our campus."
And it's a great campus.
It's a quick drive, and I've always been naturally curious, if you can't tell. So I was like, "Well, what's the worst thing that can happen?" And I remember telling my husband the same thing. And he looked at me, he's like, "Oh, these conversations are always dangerous." But I was like, "But God, we had just bought a house in South Pasadena. We were getting settled." And so I go to Google, I go to the round of interviews, and the next day I'm home and I get a call and they said, "We want to hire you, but we want to upgrade the job. And so you're going to be an L8, which I had no idea what the levels were at that point. Everything was so obscure. And we'll get back to you on the offer." And that had never happened to me in my life. And I was like, first of all, I had no idea I wasn't even interviewing for an executive role.
Right.
I had no idea what you were looking for. But a couple of days later, they put an offer in place. And and they sold me on this idea of, "You come to Google and we can change the world."
Yeah.
And I was, I was taken. I loved my manager at Disney, who was our head of HR, and my mentor. There was a high potential leadership program. My mentor was Gary Marsh, who was the president of Disney Channel. And I remember going to both of them to say, "Well, I've got," like really meekly, like, "I've got this offer from Google." And they both looked at me and they were like, "We're not going to tell you not to take it."
Yeah, Google.
And they're like, "Go. Like, we don't want you to go, but go." So I had their blessing and support. And so my family picked up again and we moved to Burlingame, California. Again, my husband, a great partner. By this point, my daughter was 7. So she was a little bit unhappy about leaving, but still kind of a little clueless. And I spent 2 of the most intense years of my career at Google. I met and befriended some of the most amazing people in my life. I was given the charge of building a diverse strategy for recruitment across the organization in one of the most complex recruitment functions I have ever worked at. I'm talking thousands of employees. And it was both challenging and exciting and frustrating and kind of soul crushing at times.
Yeah.
And it was the hardest decision. It was actually the hardest exit I've ever made. And mostly because, Kate, and this happens to, I think, a lot of us, I had made it. I was, I was at the company everybody wants to be in, and I wanted out. So I felt there had to be something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't me. It was the system. It was the process. It was the leaders. It was a combination of so many things that I alone knew I couldn't solve for, but that I knew wasn't right for me. And so I had an opportunity. At this point, the person who became my manager at Viacom they'd been courting me for quite some time. And I really was feeling homesick and wanting to be back in New York. And literally the day that my husband and I were talking about coming back to New York, my great grandmother had passed away, and it had taken me about a day to get to the island, the Dominican Republic. And I remember calling my husband from the DR and saying, we've got to move. I can't be this far from my family. It's this isn't working. My personal and my professional are just not melding, and I'm not happy. And literally that day I got a call from Viacom. And so I got the job. And the offer was to head up talent acquisition. And I really didn't want to do that anymore, right? I had been doing these more expansive roles, but there was a promise, as there always is, of, well, you can do more diversity work, which you love. We can transform the organization. Just come and fix this. So I did. We moved back to New York. By this point, my daughter's 9. This is how I measure everything, by the way, but my daughter's ages in all career moves. We moved to Brooklyn, which is where I'm talking to you now. I live in Bed-Stuy. We love it. My family was over the moon. We came back, and I went to Viacom, and over a course of a year, restructured the talent acquisition function and really just helped a team that was incredibly bright and smart rethink what they did with an inclusive lens. But at the end of a year, as we were restructuring everything, I've essentially restructured myself out of a job. And all of a sudden, I'm having that difficult conversation. And it was the hardest conversation I've ever had. Like, there's not a job for you now. However, I had a lawyer. Like, I was prepared. And I also was under contract. And so I still had a year left on my contract. And so I took advantage of that. And I spent a year traveling, a year discovering, a year. I mean, it was the biggest gift I had. But I remember right before that happened, as I was trying to grapple with leaving Viacom and what my next steps were, I did a 2-day intensive soul searching session with an executive coach who's a good friend of mine. And I remember telling him, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he kept on saying, like, you've got 11 months to figure it out. And I was like, but like, who does that? My people don't do that. Like, my identity is so tightly tied to my work and what I do. And he just reminded me, he's like, you're an executive. You've earned this. And by the way, and Kate, men do this all the time.
All the time.
What's the guilt, Daisy? What's the guilt? So I spent a year doing this. I volunteered. One of my favorite engagements was working with the Hollywood Commission to eliminate sexual harassment and advance equality in the workplace with Dr. Anita Hill, who's become a mentor and dear friend. And, you know, I sit on several boards, Planned Parenthood, Brooklyn Children's Museum. And so I became like that really active board member. I was like, let's build your diversity plan. Let's build your HR plan. And over the course of that year, as headhunters kept on calling me about chief diversity officer roles, I said, no, I don't want to be a chief diversity officer anymore. If I go back to the corporate space, I am going to run all of people. And the feedback that I got was, well, that's great, but you've never done it. And I was like, it's okay. A lot of people haven't done a lot of jobs that I have given them in my past. I have hired a lot of executives to things that they've never done before, but because they had a friend in the company, because they had someone that believed in them, they got the job. And so I have actually the credibility and the experience and the skill set to do this. So I'm going to wait. And I ended up doing my consultancy. And I really thought I was going to, which is when you and I met, I thought I was going to consult forever. I loved I was oversubscribed within 4 weeks of doing it. I felt so incredibly humbled and grateful. But then the pandemic hit. Everything started shifting all around us. I started seeing the waves of people who had been talking about investing in diversity and inclusion, even in just the first couple of weeks, Kate, stop investing, stop supporting it.
Yeah, we saw it too.
Quickly. programs like yours, I mean, companies like yours, like everybody was like, well, like the first things that go are diversity and inclusion. And I just started doubling down on this. And I had a headhunter who I knew called and said, I think I've got the perfect CPO job for you. It's at Vice Media. And I met Nancy DeBook, my boss, over video in late March because we were all quarantined. And on May 11th, I joined Vice. 2 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered. The entire world discovered racism, that a racism that many of us had been experiencing for our entire lives. And it was like being at the right place at the right time, Kate. I often think about it like while the world was spinning, I was holding space for an organization. And I was able to, with the credibility of having been a D&I practitioner, be able to sit down with leaders who were about to lose their minds and say, here's what we're going to do. You're not going to do anything. You're going to reflect on your role and the role you want to play. And we're going to figure out what the root cause of the challenges are. And then we're going to build the right solutions. We're not going to react. We're going to thoughtfully respond and correct where we need to. And that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years.
So with the last couple of minutes, this always goes by so fast, and your career is so fantastic. And I love how you brought up earlier the lateral move, because I think people always think it's that linear A, B, C, D, and thinking about how you've adapted and moved and mobility and obviously having an incredibly supportive partner. But with the 4 minutes we have left, let's talk about the book, because this is the book, The Inclusion Revolution. This is a roadmap, right? This is, so can you tell us, and first of all, you can buy it now everywhere. So wherever you want, Luminary. And I'll at the end, I'll talk about an event we're having with Daisy in 2 weeks, but just give us the synopsis of this and why.
So Inclusion Revolution, the essential guide to dismantling racial inequity in the workplace. It's the book that I wrote. It's intended for managers. And, and throughout my career, I have realized that the two challenges that we have to achieve true diversity, equity, and inclusion is making sure that we are building the right skills and that we have the will to drive change. And so I wanted to write a book that gives you all the skills. There are checklists, there are toolkits throughout this entire book. It goes through the entire life journey of employees, from recruitment to onboarding, professional development, employee survey engagement, the whole gamut. It focuses on all of the interventions that managers can deliver across the board, but it's also intended to be an inspirational book to help you build that will to drive change. And it follows a model that I've used throughout my career, which is reflect, visualize, act, and persist. Before you get any work done, you need to reflect and figure out who you are, what you want to do, in context of what. You have to visualize, which in corporate terms is usually roadmap building and strategy building, but you have to visualize, what does your organization look like? And you have to be really honest about what you're afraid of, right? Where your concerns are, why don't you think you can drive that change? And then you have to act. And you have to deliver these interventions, these efforts, support these organizations, test it out. And persist is the last step. It's not really the last step. It's a generative process, but it's my favorite, because I do fundamentally believe that if we persist when obstacles arise, if we see things for what they are and say, okay, this is an obstacle that I need to erase because I have already built the goals and the strategies for what I want to do. And I know these obstacles are going to arise, but I am going to push through it, not by myself. I'm going to bring Kate along. I'm going to bring Reshma along. I'm going to bring people along to drive this change. We will truly build lasting and sustainable workplaces that work for everyone.
So say those 4 words again.
Reflect, visualize, act, and persist.
I love those. So where you are currently doing this amazing, huge role at Vice, Chief People Officer, you're out on your virtual right now book tour, which is, so people, it's available now. And I will say, whether you're a business owner, you're in transition, you're an employer, you're an employee, this is such, like you said, a roadmap, a toolkit that can help no matter what stage you're at in your career.
Whether, and by the way, whether you're a manager now or an aspiring manager, These are the toolkits that we need. And we've put a lot of pressure and will continue to put pressure on managers and organizations, but we haven't given them the support and the guidance that they need. And this is a bit of a love note to you managers that want to do this right. The managers that want to shine a light on your employees, and the managers that want to ensure that everyone who works for you feels that they're seen, heard, and valued, because that's what we all want to feel.
Absolutely. And especially as we've seen women being the most impacted by this pandemic, working parents, women of color, the most impacted. So
The most marginalized.
Yes. We're catching up. When we were catching up earlier, I love how you said it was a love note. This book is a love note to everything that you've done over the last 20 plus years, which is just remarkable. Little plug for Daisy. We have an event at Luminary that's open to everyone. We're going to be in person in New York and online. So if you go to Luminary's website, weareluminary.com, it is an incredible lineup of some powerful women and now women authors: Daisy, Minda Hartz, Tiffany Dufu, Alana Raya, and Fran Hauser. It is March 23rd.
Yes.
So be there or be square. Daisy, it's so good catching up. I'm so excited for you and this book and everything that you're doing. And really, you are changing the workplaces for the better.
We're all trying, as are you, Kate. And so thank you for having me, and excited to be in our talk in a couple of weeks.
We'll see you then. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week on Goaldigger. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.